Sail, sail thy best ship of democracy. Of value is thy freight. Earth's resume entire floats on thy keel. Sail, sail thy best ship of democracy. Of value is thy freight. Now, it's actually hard to imagine, for me anyway, thinking of democracy in this way, as a majestic ship cruising through the body politic with our hopes and our dreams stored in its hold. But of course, context is helpful, because the ship, even then, found itself in the midst of a storm. The poet Walt Whitman, who wrote these words, was well aware of the challenges before his still new country. Democracy in the 19th century, when he lived, was challenged repeatedly. It was finding its place in the midst of slavery and rampant disenfranchisement. It was a stratified society where upward mobility was for the already wealthy. And American democracy anyway, even after the Civil War, had failed to resolve these underlying issues. But still, somehow, he sounds optimistic, personifying this concept of democracy as the ideal form of government that will ultimately lead to an egalitarian social order that embraces us in our diversity. And back then, he thought to pray for its slow-moving success. So do we. So do we. Steer then with good strong hand and wary eye, O helmsman. Thou carriest great companions. But just as back then in Whitman's time, we too find ourselves in a crisis of democracy. And it may even be the same one. And certainly it's one that has inherited a great deal from the past. This crisis has been developing for a long time, but for some, it was only recently realized. As if a couple of cycles ago, everything in the world, everything in our government, everything in the democratic process itself was doing just fine. Now, when I was a kid in the 1980s, my parents and their friends, who were for the most part professional politicians and organizers, would talk about and worry about sometime in the future, between the time when the old, worn-out political rules ceased to function and the time when the new rules, for better or for worse, would have yet to be formed. This between time, they said, would feel upside down for many people. And both ideologues and political opportunists would try to rise up to seize control, taking advantage of the fear and anxiety that the decline of the old order inevitably brings. And since that time, over the years, we have learned. We have learned what this between time would look like because we are in it now. Machiavelli once observed that there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in a new order of things. And now, if you read the paper, pay any attention to the news, everything feels perilous. But we knew the basic outline of this shift decades ago. Back in the 80s, we could already see political power moving from a professional class of career public servants into the hands of wealthy individuals from more self-serving fields. And some of these new people were sincere and are sincere. And some of them were cynical and are cynical. All of them possessed a veneer of populism that they rarely, if ever, earned or deserved. And this shift naturally brought with it other shifts. Back then, we were accustomed to celebrating collaboration amongst what we called statesmen. And we called them statesmen because they were literally men, and almost always white. Yet they represented people with diverse opinions and constituencies. And they were good people. People like Daniel Patrick Moynihan or Robert Byrd or William Cohen, who cared about the institution as a whole and who sought compromise when they could. But now, today, moving among the powers, both those old professionals and the new oligarchs, moving among those powers, there are women and people of color holding the door open for everyone else. So the old system of compromise and civility between individuals with similar backgrounds and expectations gave way for reasons both good and bad. And it gave way partly to ideological concerns, partly to self-interested individuals and corporations, and partly to ill-defined tribalism. So that now from the highest office to the simplest citizen, our lines of communication between different groups and different constituencies appears frayed where they exist, while also feeling increasingly rare. Now finally, there was another thing that we noticed back in the 80s. And that was that in the future, we were all going to be living much closer together. We have seen this physically, geographically, as people move about the country and the continent and the globe in search of some kind of stability. And it means that here in Natick, Massachusetts, our neighbors might still be from New England, but they might be from Old England, or Alabama, or California, or Germany, or Guatemala. Each neighbor holding a different worldview, a different set of expectations and customs. Sometimes we notice those differences right away, don't we? But sometimes we notice those differences only after we have walked into an argument. And of course, it can make people uncomfortable to learn that what we perceive as facts about the world we live in aren't universally held after all. And so in the midst of all these arguments, our tribal affiliations, some of which we didn't even know we had, become stronger. And then people start worrying about things like the caravan of immigrants thousands of miles away and who is using the appropriate bathroom. We are living more closely together. And we are living more closely together because of technology as well. Social networks like Facebook or Instagram also bring us into contact with diverse people and opinions. As we see in the example of that caravan, in some ways technology transcends geography, making us feel closer in good ways and bad to old friends and to strangers who we do not really know and who are frequently far, far away. Now, all of this has made us see democracy in a different light. And here in polite society, sometimes we fear that the ship is leaking, or maybe even sinking. Increasingly, people do not see democracy as essential to our civic life. We know this. We see it in the decline of voting, and we see that in polling. People are frustrated. They are tired. They do not feel heard. They wonder They wonder if these people who claim to represent them, who claim to understand who they are and how they live, in fact do represent or understand them at all. And of course, sometimes they, and sometimes we, wonder about the basic competency of our leadership. Many people feel that somehow this government is set up for someone else, maybe merely for itself, and not for them, and not for us. You know what? In a sense, they're right. In fact, it has always been this way. Back in the time of Whitman, another great thinker and leader named Frederick Douglass reminded people that power concedes nothing without a demand. Power concedes nothing without a demand. And things like gerrymandering and voter suppression and the wealthy funding elections didn't magically appear out of the blue 2 years ago. It's just that now more people are noticing. It's just that now fewer people are willing to go along to get along. More people are making demands. So as we lament the decline of civility and good order, we must remember what civility and good order concealed. It concealed democracy's failings. It allowed us to ignore the margins in favor of our own comfort. Universalist minister Clinton Lee Scott, someone that I quote here frequently, the Universalist minister Clinton Lee Scott once wrote that it is easier to pay homage to prophets than to heed the direction of their vision. It is easier, he says, blindly to venerate the saints than to learn the human quality of their sainthood. This is true of people, and it is true of ideas. It is true of institutions. I believe that what we are grieving today isn't really the sinking ship of democracy, but the illusion of democracy that we chose to worship at the expense of others, and therefore at the expense of ourselves. Democracy is not a god. It is a tool. Tools can be used for good or for ill. It depends on the intent and the gifts of the user. And so we hear those words from our psalm today. Do not trust in rulers, in mortals, in whom there is no salvation. Now, I'll tell you what those politicians and organizers of my youth decided when they saw the coming storm decades ago. Because many of them are still fighting the fight today. And their decision, which I believe should be our decision, is best enunciated by the words of an old spiritual that was originally called the gospel plow. The gospel plow. You'll recognize it when I get to it. Keep your eyes on the prize, it says, and hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize and hold on. Now, you may have heard this before. Some of you have most definitely heard this before because we've sung it in church. But what I meant was, of course, that it was a staple of the civil rights movement. A movement well aware of the limits of civility, well aware of the limits of politeness, well aware of the limits of simply voting over and over again without making a noise or a complaint. The prize, however, the prize that they're talking about is something greater, as you may have gathered from a hymn called Gospel Plow. That greater thing that sustains us during times of trouble isn't a mere set of rules for governance, no matter how poetic, but the divine, the transcendent, that calls us on our path toward the commonwealth of heaven and sustains us in our actions. Psalm 146 reminds us of that prize. You keep faith forever. You secure justice for the oppressed. You give food to the hungry. You set captives free. You raised up those who are bowed down. You love those who do justice. Now, I have already voted. And I know that many of you have also. And I hope and pray that the rest of you do as well. But it is literally the least we can do. It is literally the first step, not the last. Democracy, as we practice it in this country, will not bring justice or peace on its own. What will do so, however, are people. People strengthened and sustained by a vision of a better world, hearing a call that takes them, that takes us to the streets in protest and celebration, to the oppressed in support and service, and to our neighbors, both strangers and friends, with open arms and open hearts, in faith, hope, forgiveness, and love. When we cease to give authority to a process, to a human institution, and instead see the divine in each other, then we will learn to leave our tribes, to take our place in the whole of creation. So let us take a moment now to set our eyes on that prize and to determine the path we will walk to get us there.